Thank you, Sasha, and thanks to all of you for joining us today, wherever you may be. I see a few of you with dark windows behind you, and I know Katya is turning toward dinner time, so I'm grateful wherever you are that you came out. Katja Bruish we'll do the business side of things first. She is an assistant professor in environmental history at Trinity in Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, where she is working on a fascinating project on the history of peat production and industrialization in Russia over the longue durée. She completed her first monograph on the agrarian question and examined in depth a number of experts, their ideas, their sociability, their milieu in late Imperial and early Soviet Russia. And it was when she was working on that project that I had the great good fortune of meeting her in the Russian State Archive of the Economy, of Economics at Gaia, where she was my comrade in arms for stretches of months over the course of several years. And I delighted in hearing about her work then. And I'm so looking forward to having the opportunity to hear about it now. So Katya, I will hand the reins over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me, for introducing me, and also Sasha for organizing this talk so neatly beforehand. I'll share my screen now for you, with you. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good.
So yeah, as Anne has mentioned, I'm working on the unlikely subject of peat. And it was actually in August 2010 when I was still working on this other project that Anne just mentioned that I first encountered Russian peatlands. I arrived in Moscow on August the 1st to take up a position that I had before I came to Trinity, and all I could see and breathe was smoke. Sorry, I just need to, here we go. The summer of 2010 was an exceptionally warm and dry summer, and in large parts of central Russia drained peat bogs and forests had caught fire. And these fires produced a smoke that found its way into the eyes and the lungs of people in the regions immediately affected by these fires and in the city of Moscow. And the smoke also made it into international newspapers, as you can see here. The situation lasted for weeks and was, for me at least, quite a remarkable experience that, in a very bodily sense, made me aware of how human and natural histories are intertwined. For commentators at the time quickly pointed out that the peat fires had to do with human doing in the not too distant past. However, apart from the rather obvious point that drainage had made these landscapes vulnerable to fire and that global warming increases the fire vulnerability of degraded peatlands, I couldn't really find a good explanation for this phenomenon. A New York Times article from August 2010 indicated that Soviet engineers had drained these peatlands shortly after the revolution to generate electricity, using the revolution as a handy shortcut to explain things that have gone wrong in Russia. So like any other parts of nature, peatlands, of course, are not naturally a resource. Resources, as geographer Gavin Bridge has put it, I quote, are a cultural category into which societies place those components of the non-human world that are considered to be useful or valuable in some way. So my interest here is not so much in using my knowledge about the vulnerability of drained wetlands to point my fingers at the past errors and the people who did them. Rather, I'm trying to find out why people in the past actually thought that appropriating Russia's swamps was a good idea. And from the sources I've looked at, this made a lot of sense. So it is actually the making of natural resources, the messy and arbitrary social process during which people explored, mapped, priced, and exploited peatlands, which will be in the center of my talk today. So while indeed the early Soviet government made huge and successful efforts to turn peat into electricity, peat extraction predated the revolution. Already in the 18th century, peat appeared as a potential industrial fuel in scientific writings. However, it was only in the second half of the 19th century that manufacturing enterprises began to use it more systematically. A pavilion at the 1882 All Russia Art and Industry exhibition in Moscow displayed samples of peat that had been brought there from the provinces of Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, Vladimir, and Orlov. Amidst desirable luxuries, consumer goods, and cutting-edge technologies, of course, peat seemed a rather unlikely representation of Russia's latest achievements in the realms of arts and industry. And yet the peat samples conveyed a clear message. Storing energy of a category similar to the better known coal, the extensive marshlands of Russia constituted reservoirs of untapped resources for industrial growth. The catalogue of the exhibition informed the public that what the exposition sought to demonstrate had already become reality in one of the most eminent centers of the Russian manufacturing industry. At the very border of the Moscow and Vladimir provinces, the Sava-Morozov Sons company, the Nikolskaya Fabrika, which was Russia's largest textile mill at the time, exploited around 1,300 desyatinas of state-owned peatlands, which the company had rented from the treasury. In 1881, more than 5,000 men and women, a fifth out of the corporation's total 25,000 workers, had dug out some 8 million pud of peat to power the mills. The Morozov mills, I would say, were no exception, but rather a paradigmatic example of the larger shift in the social metabolism of the late imperial economy. Previously largely based on the exploitation of woodlands, the production of goods in the late Russian Empire increasingly relied on what has been called the subterranean forest, fossilized organic matter with an energy content higher than that of trees. So stocks, rather than flows of energy, became crucial ingredients of commercial success. From the 1880s, trains and vessels shipped ever larger amounts of combustibles from the coal mines of the Donbass and the oil fields of Baku to the industrial hotspots of the Russian Empire. However, Russia's rising fossil economy drew on less iconic fuel deposits too. As the country embarked on a trajectory of modern economic growth, industrial producers, particularly in the provinces of Moscow and Vladimir, paid attention to the bountiful peatlands located close to their manufacturing sites and along train lines. So taking this evidence seriously allows us to ask new questions about the history of the modern Russian economy. What was the resource base of modern Russian economic growth? How was Russia's gradual exit from the wooden age determined by the spatial distribution of energy resources? And at what scale can we study the intertwined social and environmental dimensions of Russian industrialization? I would argue that looking at seemingly marginal spaces, such as the peatlands of central Russia, refines our picture of the natural and human geographies of Russian economic growth and helps explain some trajectories and resource use, some trajectories of resource use and energy generation following the 1917 revolution. So in my talk today, I will move from a macro to a meso to a micro perspective. I will first look at the role of peat in the rise of Russia's fossil economy. I will secondly talk about the role of the imperial state as a resource maker. Then I will look at the social practice of mapping and pricing swamps. And in my conclusions, I will try to put all of this in a planetary, perspective. So if we want to establish the significance of peat fuel in late imperial Russia, we have to read statistics against the grain. According to Lev Gaffengaus, peat accounted for some negligible 2.5% of all fuel use in 1908. And by 1913, its share had even fallen to 2.2%. So these are really very, very small numbers, obviously, and you can ask, why should we actually care? If we consider absolute instead of relative numbers, the picture looks different. Contrasting with the relative decline of peat is a quite drastic increase of peat fuel in absolute terms. And at the same time, a significant increase of overall fuel use. So the late imperial economy became increasingly energy intensive. So peat actually became more and not less important. If we extend the time frame, we can see this even better. Between 1887 and 1913, peat fuel use in Russia grew by 407%, and this much faster than overall fuel use, which increased by 292%. The rise of peat was part of what Kaffengaus called the mineralization of Russia's energy budget, a process characterized by skyrocketing coal and oil use and the relative and also absolute decline in wood fuel. The diverse physical and economic geography of the Russian Empire may help us explain these trends. While peat played a marginal role in the aggregated energy budget, it contributed considerably to the expansion of industrial production in certain parts of the empire. In the so-called Central Industrial Region, the province of Moscow and neighboring provinces, economic growth was predicated upon the ability of industrial companies to appropriate peat bogs close to their factories. Introducing an environmental perspective to the history of Russian industrialization, we therefore have to consider the economic diversity of the empire and the importance of the region as a unit of analysis in modern Russian history. In 1889, according to official statistics, peat contributed more than a third to the overall energy use in the booming cotton mills of the Moscow and Vladimir provinces, and thus to one of the most dynamic industrial sectors of the empire. Here's a map from the Moscow province in 1890, and I've highlighted here the area around the city of Bagorodsk. Nowadays, that's city of Naginsk, where in the early 20th century, the first peat-based power plant was built. And this is also the area where yeah, I think you should be able to see my cursor. This is where the Nikolskaya Fabrika was located nowadays. That's the city of Orekhovo-Zhuyevo. And that was one of the most important peat mining regions in the late Russian Empire. Here we have these chimneys here, and we can assume that so if a third of all the peat, all the fuel used in the Morozov company was actually from peat, so that is actually, so part of the smoke that would be coming out of this chimney would be generated from the peat that was exploited in the peat bogs close to that company. Exploring the history of peat use reveals links between places, actors, and environments that are hidden in most histories of the late imperial economy. The textile industry was an important catalyst of social and environmental change. We know that textile mills contributed to the rise of capitalist labor relations even before the end of serfdoms, and also that the extensive demand for fibers deeply transformed social and physical geographies in the cotton growing regions of Central Asia. Yet textile production also transformed environments in places that had nothing to do with cotton farming at all. In order to make fibers into fabric, textile mills required plenty of heat energy. And much of this heat energy originated from the peat bogs close to the mills. Environmental historian John McNeill has recently argued that cheap energy and industrialization created what he calls ecological teleconnections between distant corners of the world. And I would argue that we can find such ecological teleconnections also within the Russian Empire. The peatlands of Vladimir and Moscow were among the many factors that made cotton farming in Central Asia profitable. So here we can, on this slide, we can see here, this is a peat bog, or a peatland where peat is being put into little staples for to drain or to dry. Industrial demand for peat also created new links between land and labor. Preparing a bog for excavation, as well as the cutting, drying, and stacking of peat, were arduous tasks which necessitated, in the first instance, men and women who would employ the power of their muscles to unlock the energy of the swamps. The transformation of peatlands into extraction sites was predicated upon the mobility of the rural population in the decades following the end of serfdom, when seasonal peasant workers provided the bulk of labor for Russia's growing industry. Peatlands in central Russia became a site of this trend too. Organized in artels, women and men from the villages got employed in peat extraction, usually for a couple of months between the sowing and the harvesting periods. In the 3 decades before World War I, the amount of peat workers in the Russian Empire increased from just under 15,000 to almost 56,000, when they still exceeded the number of workers that were involved in oil drilling. Introducing peat into our histories of the late imperial economy, therefore, reveals not only a so far overlooked layer of environmental change that is connected to Russian industrialization and the rise of Russia's industrial metabolism. It also adds to our picture of the wide-ranging lived experiences that constituted this process. So the exploitation of peat bogs for fuel neatly fit 19th century anxieties about the depletion of central Russian forests. Other than forests, peatlands were thought to exist in abundance. So adopting peat in industrial context promised to ease the pressure on the country's woodlands and at the same time retain the essence of the central Russian landscape. No less a character than Mikhail Ostrov, the physician and outspoken advocate of forest conservation in Anton Chekhov's Uncle Vanya, suggested that people burn peat in their stoves instead of wood. So promoting the idea that mining peat represented a way around the resource dilemma facing European Russia, state officials, scientists, and writers constructed a hierarchy of ecosystems that would inform the cultural perceptions and practical uses of peatlands until way into the 20th century. Peatlands should be exploited for the sake of Russia's forests. So even though industrial enterprises were the most important users of peat fuel, the transformation of wet pieces of land into resource frontiers of the expanding economy would have been unthinkable without the active role of the imperial administration. As part of the efforts to conserve forests, state institutions tried to foster peat extraction in the province of Moscow since the reign of Nicholas I. The creation of a peat section within the Ministry of State Domains in 1883 established peatlands management as a regular realm of state governance. This new unit, which soon had representations in the provinces of Moscow, Vladimir, Nizhny Novgorod, Tambov, and St. Petersburg, provided essential resources and expertise for the exploration and also the subsequent exploitation of peatlands. Its central task was to turn unprofitable state-owned lands, wetlands, into value-bearing assets by turning them into so-called obrochnie stati. These were rental titles for which the ministry extracted fiscal revenue from state-owned resources by leasing them out for temporary use. In the decades before the revolution, such temporary leases of peatlands secured a small, though steady flow of income for the state. In 1914, private users, mostly from the provinces of Moscow, Tver, and Vladimir, exploited a little over 100 state-owned peat bogs for lease periods of sometimes up to 60 years, which also shows that they had actually incorporated peat into their energy into their energy use. At the same time, the peat division had also become very active in surveying and assessing privately owned wetlands. upon request of private landowners who similarly wanted to extract value from land that otherwise was of no use to them. When it came to a concrete peatland, though, opinions about what to make of this peatland could diverge. Take the case of Andrei Yefimov, for instance, a peasant from the province of Tver, who approached the regional branch of the Ministry of Agriculture in 1910 when he inquired whether he could rent a marshland close to his native village. Yefimov wanted to use the plot as a hay meadow or as a grazing ground for his livestock. For the state, Yefimov argued the lease would carry clear financial benefits. Instead of maintaining a woodman to oversee a wet and fallow piece of land, the treasury could receive a regular income, while he himself would invest his labor and take the risk of draining the marsh. The peasant was well aware that such a deal would require that the monetary value of the plot be established, and he hurried to express his confidence in the administration's expertise to price the land. I quote, "I cannot suggest a concrete price because it is uncertain which use there will be, as this is a swamp. It will be easier for the treasury to set the price." So while for Yefimov, this seemed like a rather straightforward suggestion, the matter looked much more complicated from the perspective of the administration. The staff in the Peat division lacked even the most basic information about the piece of land that had caught the peasants' interest. Was it a peat bog? And if this was the case, would Yefimov's proposed plan damage the peat that could potentially be used as a source of fuel? And after all, wouldn't the financial benefits for the treasury be much more substantial if the land was leased to someone interested in peat extraction, rather than a peasant who wanted the plot just for his livestock? In light of so many questions, the staff were unwilling to give their consent. The plot had not yet been surveyed, so the decision was postponed. This anecdote neatly, I think, illustrates that resource making can be a contested process, as people may value the same part of nature for different purposes, for different reasons. The peasants' proposal was in line with the government's broader aim to develop the farming sector and also fit with the aspiration to augment the state budget by letting the population pay for using state assets. Still, the vague possibility that the plot could be turned into a peat extraction site prevented the officials in the Peat division from approving Yefimov's request. Apparently because they thought that the state could achieve higher lease payments from an hypothetical industrial extractor, and maybe too because they regarded the extraction of peat to be a more timely way to use a wetland than letting animals graze on it. So clearly, what constituted the best way to exploit Russia's wetlands was a matter of perspective, and lack of information did not make things easier, which brings me to the part on the mapping and the pricing of peatlands. So as I mentioned before, its abundance was one of the main characteristics that made peat so promising for people in need of an alternative to wood fuel. From the 18th century, when peat first became a subject of scientific and economic interest, until the 20th century, peat was depicted as an undepletable resource that could satisfy the economy's energy needs for centuries ahead. For a long while, however, the abundance of peat was a hypothesis rather than a proven fact. On this map, which was published by the Free Economic Society shortly after Prince Dolgorukov in the 1790s announced that he had discovered a peat deposit on his land, just a narrow stripe of land along the river of the river Gravorna, which is nowadays one of many underground rivers in the city of Moscow, as I learned. So here, these are the peat deposits that they knew about. A map of peat deposits of the province of Moscow, published by the Ministry of State Domains in the 1840s, similarly contains only fragmented information about peat deposits suitable for extraction. Interestingly, though, the map already highlights deposits in the east of the Moscow province, close to the city of Bagorodsk, which I mentioned earlier, where in 1913 the first peat-based electric plant would be built. In the late Imperial period, the Peat division played a crucial role in producing geographic knowledge about Russia's peatlands. In 1914, Ivan Vichlaev, who had just become the head of the Peat division, published a comprehensive map of peatlands in European Russia, which indicated the share of peatlands in the overall territory of any given province. Based on a combination of survey information and estimates, the map revealed the state's territorial attitude towards the governance of natural wealth, and at the same time, the increasing attention given to environmental factors in imperial geography. Arguably, the most advanced example of wetland cartography of the time, Vichlaev's map reproduced the notion of abundance that had been underpinning the mental and physical appropriation of Russian peatlands since the 18th century. In 1914, the map implied abundance had become a scientific fact. Peat could be virtually found all over European Russia, and the state knew quite well how it was distributed. However, not all peat was the same. Peat is a complex matter, the product of the conditions under which a specific peatland had formed, the composition of plants that over thousands of years decayed into peat, the soil, and atmospheric conditions. So peats of different sorts had different capacities to burn and produce heat, and so the analysis of the peat itself became a crucial part of peatlands assessment. Tracing how people classified peat, we can observe not only the gradual evolution of scientific knowledge about peat soils, we also get an idea of the accompanying process of abstraction by which peat was valued separately from its living environment and described in homogenizing categories that reflected human needs rather than the diversity of peatlands. When in 1793, a certain chemist Lovitz received 2 samples of peat for examination, he described the flame as well as the smoke of burning peat, and he used these criteria to establish how suitable these samples would be for industrial use. In the early 20th century, modern chemistry had largely replaced already the experience-based evidence of the kind that Lovitz had produced with his hands, his eyes, and his nose. Establishing the carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and ash content, scientists were now able to make inferences regarding the usefulness of a certain peat sample. And this is exactly what the Peat division was doing. The Peat division had a lab where it examined soil samples from state-owned peatlands and also from privately owned wetlands. The late Imperial Land Administration had thus become a space where local wetland environments and abstract science intersected. Pricing peatlands was no less intricate than mapping and assessing them. When imperial officials created obrochные stati and defined payment rates for the use of a state-owned asset, they usually took the estimated market value of the yield from a given title as a basis. So the price of wood in the case of a forest, of grain in the case of a field, or a fish in the case of fishing grounds. With peat, this was quite difficult because actually no real market for it existed. Ascribing monetary value to a peatland, or primary valuation, первоначальная оценка, as this procedure was called in bureaucratic language, was a complex and arbitrary undertaking. The officials in the peat division had to consider a host of parameters: the quality of the peat, the location of a peat bog, as well as the price of other fuels. In 1884, for instance, they praised a huge peatland northwest of the city of Moscow. The peatland was located very close to a silk and a carpet factory, a cotton mill, and a distillery, so the officials decided there would actually be a demand for peat in the region. Given that the peat mass of the bog was of various quality, they decided that a cubic sergeant of dry peat, which is about 2.5 cubic meters, would be worth 25 kopecks. The peat from a close-by deposit was priced at 20 kopecks, given its unfortunate location, while the first-class peat from a deposit in the Tver province, in contrast, ranked at only 10 kopecks, as the peat bog was surrounded by private land, was hard to access, and located in quite some distance from the railways. Pegging a price tag to wetlands, the staff of the Peat division defined the value of wetlands in relational rather than material terms. It was one of the many steps toward the homogenization of nature through the unifying language of money, in which price differences remained the only representations of local variation, and complex ecosystems were split into seemingly unconnected entities. Through the work of late imperial bureaucrats, peat turned into an alienable industrial resource and was stripped of the complex wetland environments from which it was taken. The imperial state thus actively participated in the construction of peatlands as resources, combining land management with policies to provide industrial companies with access to cheap energy. I come to my conclusions. In the late imperial period, ever larger parts of Russia's nature became woven into the spaces and processes of industrial production. And as elsewhere, industrial expansion increasingly rested upon the mobilization of energy sources buried in the ground. The rise of the fossil fuel age is often depicted as a quasi-linear process during which humans gradually replaced wood by coal and later petroleum and gas. And given Russia's position as a major player on the global energy markets, we tend to think about the country's energy history in very similar terms. However, this narrative falls short of the high degree of regional variation in the emergence of industrial metabolisms around the world. Histories of energy tend to relegate peat to the pre-industrial or traditional sources of heat. A closer look, however, at the immediate environments of late imperial Russian manufacturing companies suggests otherwise. Reflecting Russia's specific physical and economic geography, peat, in fact, was not only one of the multiple ingredients that fueled modern economic growth. In fact, it only became a resource in the process of industrialization. As a result, peatland ecosystems became subject to the same values that drove commercial activity. So writing the environmental history of Russian industrialization, which I think is a striking gap in the literature, we should not forget those places that provided some of the crucial ingredients for industrial production, and after the revolution, also for the generation of electric power. The landscapes of Central Russia are nowadays an archive of the substantial changes on the Earth's surface, a century that were made during a century of intensive peat extraction. Drainage canals, traces of the often disassembled tracks of narrow gauge railways, abandoned excavation sites, but also the leftovers of worker settlements are reminders of how ideas and practices of resource use have shaped human lives and natural environments. Here on the top, we can see the settlement of Shaturtorf close to Shatura, and all these areas here, these are abundant peat extraction sites, and I can talk about this in a bit more. But I would say there is a more than local, more than regional, and even more than human significance to this. Peatlands cover around 3% of the Earth's land mass, but they store twice as much carbon as all the world's forests. Draining peatlands and burning peat are activities that are climatically relevant for two reasons. They release huge amount of amounts of soil carbon into the air, and also they also destroy the carbon sink function of intact peatlands. Under conditions of global warming, this is particularly problematic because fires are an increasing threat to drain peatlands, which then accelerates carbon emissions from these lands. The preservation of intact and the restoration of damaged peatlands, therefore, have been recognized as what has been called nature-based climate change mitigation strategies. I think it is with regard to this larger context that the appropriation of peatlands is a chapter not only in the social and economic history of Russia, nor just in the history of land use change. It is also a chapter in the history of global warming. And in a time where we are thinking about how to address the challenges of the climate crisis, it might be good to remind ourselves that there were many different national and regional histories that contributed to the rise of the fossil fuel age. And just as there were many different paths into the fossil fuel age, there might also be many different paths out of it. Thank you. I would like to leave it here, but if you give me 2 more minutes, I would just like to show you a couple of pictures and a little animation that I prepared for you. Yeah,
please do, Katja. Yes.
So here again, this is the area of Chateau Torf, and I would like you to have this area in mind here. These are abundant peat extraction sites to which water has returned. This is how the site looks nowadays. And I would like to show you this because here on this animation, we can actually see how the water returns after the abandonment of excavation. The dark areas, this is water. And I have been told by a geographer that the return of this water so early without active re-wetting can be explained by the fact that just the pumps started pumping after they abandoned these fields and stopped excavating peat in the 1980s, or actually a bit before. Here they seem to have abandoned that plot already a bit before the 1980s. So that is a good news, good story from the area of Chateau Torf. But not everywhere does the water return as easily. So here on the right-hand side, we see a former extraction site where we also see that some water returns, and but it has stayed largely dry until the present day. So here we are moving, it's the right-hand side, we are moving here into the 2000s. So the water does not return automatically when excavation stops. And this is exactly what makes these landscapes so vulnerable. Just wanted to show you that so that you have an idea which different scenarios actually Russia has had and the kind of problems that Russia is facing dealing with these landscapes. Thank you. I stop sharing, I guess.
Yes, we can all put our hand clapping reactions so that we can all see. Katja, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Let me try and get myself into the appropriate format so that I can see your hand raises, participants. All right. So I was going to take my chair's prerogative and seize the floor for a question, but Eric Lohr beat me to the punch. And so I'm gonna turn over to Eric, and I also see another hand, Anne Bobrov-Hadal. And others, if you raise your hand on your screen or type your question into the chat. Oh, I see you, Christine. I will keep a list here for us. I have Eric, I have Anne, and I have Christine. And you can feel free to raise that hand whenever, and I'll keep track of it. All right, Eric, please.
Well, Anne, that's very democratic of you to recognize me before yourself. Katja, how fascinating.
It's in the spirit of the moment, Eric.
What a fascinating talk on a topic that just is one of those topics where you don't know much about it, and you hear it and you think, why haven't I heard more about it? It's so great. And just personally, the lore in my family, the Lore family, that goes back to northern Germany, and I've always heard that it was when the turf cutting industry collapsed in the late 19th century that the Lores got on steamships and came to Wisconsin. So I always heard that, and it raises a question for me as to how your story in Russia compares to northern Germany, other parts of the world. That's sort of one of the questions I had, and then the second one is if you could just say maybe briefly, for those of us who are unfamiliar with the general lay of the land, what is the history of turf fires, like in Russia, maybe elsewhere as well? Like, when were the biggest fires? When did they begin? And are they correlated with the draining of the swamps? Are they correlated with something else? And why didn't it become a bigger issue in terms of reflooding as a fire prevention method, if nothing else, earlier? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, obviously, this is not just a Russian story. And as you pointed out rightly, there are, of course, countries, for example, Northern Germany, you mentioned other countries as well, where we would, especially Ireland. So the Irish, my Irish colleagues always immediately understand what I'm talking about. Where there is a long tradition of peat cutting that was executed by actually landowners, farmers. What I'm interested mostly is actually the industrial use of peat. And that is something that was most prominent in the Netherlands during the so-called the Dutch Golden Age in the 17th centuries. And some have actually called the Dutch economy the first fossil economy, so not the British. And also in the Netherlands in the late 19th century, we see a similar development as in Russia, where there is, in the context of increasing industrial demand, also an increase in demand for peat fuel. In Germany, for example, peat played a role as well, also in industrial context, but it was more brown coal that was used. Ireland has an interesting story because their peat use had been quite widespread among farmers because there was no other fuel other than in Russia. For example, in Russia, peasants would use wood to fire their stoves until the early in the 20th century. That would be the most important fuel. In Ireland, for example, where there was no fuel, they would use peat, but then what we also see in the 20th century is similar industrialization of peat mining. In part, also, this is an entangled history, entangled Soviet-Irish history, because where do Irish engineers go in order to learn how to extract peat? Of course, they go to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. That's quite an interesting story. I think Canada, I haven't looked myself yet too much into other countries, but what I know is that it's been used in Canada as well, in Finland and Sweden, so the Nordic countries. That would be on the comparative, the question of the comparison. You asked about the history of peat fires. Of course, fires are also occur sometimes naturally, by which I mean without human interference on peatlands during lightnings, for example. But the drainage of peatlands is something that makes them much more vulnerable to fire. And the fire risk is something that has hugely increased in the context of global warming, not only in Russia. And most of the peatland drainage actually is not only related to peat extraction, but to farming. And peat fires is something that you will, I'm afraid you will hear more about in the news. It's regularly happens in Britain, in Germany, in Canada, I've read about it, and of course also now in Siberia. Without so this is something that is really so there is this, fires can break out also on sites that were not drained for extraction. What is interesting, why haven't they started reflooding that before? It was never really on the agenda because there were only a couple of instances where fire became a major issue in Russia in the 20th century. That would be in 1972. There were huge forest fires in the Soviet Union and on peat excavation sites. And I find this actually in the bookkeeping documents of a peat trust that I'm interested in, the Shatura Peat Trust, where they have huge fires in that year. Then there was one instance in 2002 and then 2010. And only after the 2010 fires, you might remember actually from that year how Putin went on a helicopter also to extinguish the forest fires along the Volga region. After that, they started some rewetting initiatives, partly with international environmental organizations, but only in some areas. And I think only in areas that are close to major urban centers, because this is something they're worried about. And also the negative press, but it's not a major item on the agenda. And I think the huge irony is actually that Russia could turn these drained peatlands into environmental capital, so to say, and rewetting them in order to show how environmentally committed they are without making any major or not too big changes to their own fossil economy. I think there is some awareness about this now among Russian scientists. Sometimes it's being Russian government acknowledges this, but in some parts of the countries, they actually extract peat, and especially in Sakhalin, I think, and they export it to China because peat is also an important horticultural and agriculture product. So there is a new market for peat now, not as a fuel, but as an agriculture product in northern China.
Wonderful, Katja. Okay, I will turn to Anne now and ask, Anne, would you like to share your question over the video, or shall I read it out?
Yeah, please read it out. I hope
Okay, sure. Yes, I see it right here. So Anne says, fantastic talk. To what extent were textile factory owners free to buy peat on their own? And to what extent did they have to go through the central bureaucracy to do that? And she asks the same question for other industries as well.
So the way how it happened is that they didn't buy peat, but they largely rented the peat bog. So peat was not an item that would often be traded. I think 90%, that's at least in contemporary articles I read, that 90% of the peat was actually not traded as on the market. So there were some companies that actually tried to commercially extract peat and turn it into briquettes, peat briquettes, and sell it. But that was not a very successful business. So what they rather did, what companies rather did, is that they rented a peat bog if they didn't have land themselves. The Morozovs, for example, they were also huge landowners anyhow. So they also had their own peatlands that they would use. So they would rent it and then pay for the extracted peat. And similar, not only textile industries, if that answers your question.
That's very interesting. That also, oh, was someone else jumping in there?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Great, thank you, Anne. All right, the next question we have is from Andy Bruno. Andy, would you like, again, same question to you. Shall I read, or would you like to do the honors yourself?
I can do the honors. Again, fabulous talk and fabulous research. Thank you so much. I was very close to your essay in environment and history until even before it was actually had page numbers, and I've kept going back, and now it finally has page numbers, which is great. I wanted to ask about this sort of the imperial imaginary here a bit, because obviously Siberia has, makes the peatlands of European Russia look, piddly, like not that much. But I was there sort of a discussion in places like Siberia where there was this, at least by the late imperial period, this desire to resettle and desire to move people there, that this was going to be a sort of major energy resource or other type of resource in the colonization process. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the irony of the peat history, of course, that most of the exploitation takes place in some parts of the country where there is, compared to Siberia, not very much peat. And this has to do with the economic geography of Russia. Peat, of course, is not or the energy density or the calorific value of peat is not very high if you compare it to other fossil fuels like coal or oil, for example. So it doesn't really make sense to transport it from one part of the empire to the other. And also, at first, no one really wanted peat. No one liked it. The state actually, I found a couple of interesting episodes from the mid-19th century, how the state actually tries to push industrialists to use it because they would have preferred other fuels, and either wood and then later coal or oil. Peat is always what you use when other things get too expensive, and then it's actually quite useful because it's so close, and that's why they started extracting in these particular areas that I mentioned, so around the city of Moscow, so in those industrializing regions. And so it was never really part of a colonization strategy. Yeah, that's my.
Thank you, Katja. Forgive me, I jumped the line because I was going based on the chat. Christine.
Yes, thank you. And this talk is really fascinating. And each time you say something, Katja, I think of another part of it that's so interesting. But the fact that there was no market for peat, and you said it was not used by consumers. And just given what you just said, I wonder if what's important about peat is land, and who owns the land and who has access to it. And is that the same as it would be in other countries like Ireland or Germany or Scandinavia? I somehow don't think so. And that might be something to think about in terms of how Russia is special. It's access to those boglands that becomes the critical point at which peat becomes valuable in a sense. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Katja, if I could I use my prerogative at this moment to just tack something on to Christine's question, because I was thinking along the same lines, and I was very struck by what you just said, that peat is what you use when other things get too expensive. And so when you find yourself in that situation, the proximity of it is one of the most valuable things about it. I wonder if you can take that feature of peat that you're describing, which we now have these other pieces of information about. One of them is that perhaps what's valuable or what's being marketed to a certain extent with peat is the land that it's located on, rather than the production of it into bricks that is being moved for fuel. Those things are all going to make, finding the price for this asset very difficult. So I'm curious if you could say a few more words about how that process worked. And in particular, do you have any information that could shed light on how it compared to appraisals for things like forest land or lands adjacent to rivers where hydroelectric power might be accessible to owners?
Yeah, the questions about the markets and the land is really very fascinating, and that's something that struck me when I was sitting in the archive, that I thought they are creating this market. And of course, you asked about what is different about Russia, and of course, what is something that I discovered is, of course, the state is an important landowner here, and this also explains why the state is so important in this resource making process, because they have the land that other people won't use, and or they create peat and turn it into something that is valuable. And yes, I think you're right. This is perhaps something I need to bring out a bit more, that this is, of course, about land use. And this is also why the the whole resource making is located within the Ministry of State Domains or later Agriculture, and not in the Ministry of Mining or something. It is a process of land management. And it is about using the state's land profitably and doing that in a way that is similar to what private landowners would also do. So so it is about Vigada. They always talk about Vigada. So what is, profitable for the state. So it's about extracting value. At the same time, I have to say, the state also acts here as some kind of development agency, because they have this industrialist agenda. They want to develop the country industrially, and by that, they never really got much money out of the peatlands, out of renting peatlands out. But they insisted that it had to be done for money, but as in the case of the peasant that I described, if they had the choice between appropriating it for farmland or for energy, in this one case that I found very telling, they actually chose not to give it to the peasant. They could have easily given him this land for a hay meadow, because they thought, oh, there might be the opportunity that we can get more money. In the late Russian Empire, the Tatmeistarskaya Trust, this is how the section in the land administration is called. They also deal with the land melioration. So that's also the drainage of peatland for the use of farming. So, and here we can see how these two are actually intertwined, and how funnily, or not funnily, but perhaps a bit counterintuitively, the whole dealing with an energy source is located within the land administration.
Right. We turn now to Vladimir Ryzhkovsky. Shall I read, or would you like to?
You can air it.
All right. The question we have from Vladimir is, could you elaborate a bit more on the relationship between the growth of the cotton industry in Central Asia and peat extraction in Central Russia?
I mean, it falls in the same time. I haven't studied this in depth yet, I have to say, but it is of course the same time after the appropriation of, or the conquest of Central Asia and the incorporation into the Russian Empire, and the cotton boom in the late 19th century, or the increasing growth of that industry, and in that context, they also use more and more sources of local fuel. But I haven't studied this in depth, so I don't want to say anything that is wrong here. So.
I wonder if, before we get too far away from it, I could note, Katja, that Heather Coleman, on your previous point, mentions in the chat that oil was in fact in the Ministry of State Domains for a long time as well.
That would have then also be related to the administration of land, or the state. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you. That is very useful, yeah.
We turn to Sohi Ryuk, who has to leave. She has perhaps already, even at this moment, left. But her question is, she was wondering whether the peat division of the Ministry of State Domains had discussions about the efficiency of peat as an energy source, and if so, whether these were related to geographic particularities of various regions, transport costs, and so forth.
They didn't really have these discussions because they were the ones that wanted peat to become an industrial fuel. These discussions I would largely see outside, where people would say, oh, it's not really, the energetic value is not very high. Then also in the during the First World War, actually, there is debate about electrification. And then this is actually when the real age of peat starts, because electrification allows to get more energy out of an energy carrier that has a low calorific value. So within the land administration, I don't find these discussions. It's more in expert writings in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, where they would measure how much can you get out of it. And some like it and others don't like it because they think, oh, there's actually not much and it's burning, it's smelling, whereas the Irish people have a very romantic attachment to the smoke of peat. This is not what Russians had at that time. So it was really something that I realized people adopted with some hesitation.
Interesting. Eric, Laura, Eric, do you want to just jump in with that question there?
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering how long it takes for a peat field to renew after it's been mined, and whether is there such a thing as renewable peat mining, where you use certain methods that make it more possible for it to recover?
Well, it always depends on the time span you're looking at. If you're thinking in human times, then it is not renewable. If you think of time spans of a couple of thousand years, this can be renewable. So peat bogs grow very slowly, and you cannot really restore a peat bog immediately. What you can restore is the carbon sink function, so that the peat bog actually starts absorbing carbon again and also starts accumulating peat. But of course, the peat that has been extracted is something that cannot be restored. The process of actually re-wetting, I think it takes a couple of years, and then you can see actually the processes that ecologists would like to see there. So the return of wildlife and biodiversity, but also the carbon sink function that I just mentioned. It's actually a very cheap. It would be quite cheap to do that because what it largely requires is just blocking the drains. So it's not a hugely difficult process. I've been told. I'm not an ecologist, of course, but from people who have done that kind of work. But it needs to be monitored, and it also depends on how deeply the peat bog has been drained. So whether the groundwater has been affected. So I just showed you the two animations before. I think in the one case, it might be that they also drained that particular bog a bit deeper so that it couldn't recover instantly.
Do we have any more questions? Oh yes, Christine has another, and then I'll jump in again as well. You have to unmute, Christine, please.
To follow up on that, was there any discussion in the Imperial period of what are we doing to our peat, to these wetlands? Was there an ecological concern on their part about what was happening? And obviously it didn't go very far, but was there a kind of developing ecological crisis in their eyes or not?
The ecological crisis in the late Russian Empire would be largely the forest crisis. Yeah. And peat would always be disadvantaged by that ecological discourse because people largely saw peatlands also as a threat. So on the one hand, they said, oh, why don't we use peat and we can protect the forest? And then something that I found quite interesting later in some part of the of Russian forestry sciences, there was this trope of peatlands disturbing forests to grow. So actually, by draining a peatlands, you are doing also not only you're creating better conditions for the forest. That's something that was quite prominent until the mid of the 20th century. There was still already emerging in the late Russian Empire some kind of peatland ecology science. Sukachov would be an important name here, who published the first work on peatlands as quite complex ecosystem, but still not with the idea that they needed to be preserved, because peatlands there are almost everywhere in northern in northern Russia. So this kind of idea that they that Russia could run out of peatlands is something that never prevailed, and I think that also impeded any efforts to protect them.
I was wondering, Katja, if I could ask you to shift gears for just a moment toward a different point that you made earlier on in your talk about the sociability of peat production and the peat artels that you described and that you had the imagery of. Could you tell us a bit about, and you know, there were a number of very evocative points. You also showed us that abandoned house, which I assume, you know, was of peat workers in the peat village. So without asking you to go too far outside the chronological horizons you've laid out, could you say more about the, I don't know, is it a story of rise and fall of the peat artel?
Yeah, no, that's definitely very interesting. So it starts in the late 19th century when I have the first sources about these things emerging, and apparently, particularly peasants of the Kaluga province were very specialized in mining peat, and they were employed then in the Moscow province. So they had the reputation of being particularly good peat workers. So they would go there regularly. And the interesting thing is, so peat is it's a seasonal activity. So it takes place in the summer month, and then people would go there. And these are largely people from the countryside who would do that after they have sown their field and before harvesting them. So they go extract peat, and then they go back. It is always a nuisance for peat extracting companies that sometimes peasants leave too early and then they haven't finished. And interestingly, this constellation of artels migrating to peat extraction sites stays actually in place until the 1950s. So the peat extraction trusts, as there would be, or peat extraction would be, or peat mining would be organized in trust in the Soviet Union, and they would make agreements with collective farms and bring these peat workers on a seasonal basis to their extraction sites. They also had, of course, year-round workers, and they increasingly, these peat settlements, they are, I think, quite an interesting example of how also then later the Soviet states penetrates the countryside and builds up also welfare institutions in rural areas, because increasingly in the 1950s, the peat extraction process is organized a bit differently, and they need less seasonal workers. So the peat industry becomes something that is more stable and more settled, and then we can see the emergence of settlements with an infrastructure, with clubs and kindergartens and hospitals and all that. So it's quite an interesting development. And nowadays, it really depends on where you are in Russia. So in some places, they're completely abundant, as the house that I've just shown you indicates. In other places, where people find a different source of income by migrating or by going to a close by city or by working in a different sector, people would still be living. So it's quite a regional thing as to what extent they have been abandoned.
That's so interesting, Katja. Thank you. Is there anything else that our group would like to hear raised before we collectively thank Katja for her heroic harvesting of this resource for us? Katja, I think it's so interesting. It seems to me that one of the themes that is emerging in our discussion, and perhaps is very familiar to you, but is new to me and very interesting, is the way in which peat sort of sits at the sidelines, or would appear to sit at the sidelines of a number of really important strands in the history of Russian industrialization and property and land use. And you're bringing it to the center. And I think what's so interesting is that you're doing that both as, you know, sort of methodologically, but also substantively. It's going to, your work involves trying to pin down some processes like valuation that can be very difficult to do for something that kind of slips and slides around, which is surprising because it's very rooted, Pete. But if that is all, I will thank everyone for joining us. And thank you again to Katja for a fascinating talk.